Welcome to episode 7 of the Filmmaking Through Music Podcast. I am your host, John Wader, and my mission is to help filmmakers like yourself achieve a more commercially appealing film through the effective use of original music and film scores. In this episode, we are talking about temp music. Probably more specifically, things to avoid when using temp music and some challenges or mistakes and consequences that a lot of filmmakers and folks that work in post-production encounter when using temp music. So let's start off with a quick definition before we go any further, just in case. Temp music is short for temporary music, and the name should be quite self-explanatory. Temp music is the music that you're putting in your film as a placeholder until you have your official score until you have your official score. Temp music and using temp music effectively is a very common, very normal part of any post-production filmmaking process. So why are we talking about challenges or issues or mistakes around temp music? And that is because I really want you to avoid these so that you do have a better experience in your entire post-production experience, in your entire post-production process, not just with your composer itself. Let's quickly chat about 4 mistakes that filmmakers run into when temping their films. First one, the big one that you've probably heard, is temp love, right? Getting too attached to your temporary music. The second mistake or challenge that I see filmmakers trying to overcome or avoid with temp music is temping their film with music that I would consider to be unnecessary for their film or doesn't fit their film. Just an example off the top of my head might be using temp music from a big sci-fi action movie for like an indie character drama. It doesn't make sense for that kind of music to be in there for the most part, right? There's give and take with that. But if you're going to temp if you're going to temp your film, make sure you're temping it with music that makes sense for your genre and the style of picture and kind of the budget level you're at as well. There's probably no need to be temping your film with grandiose, massive, epic orchestral music. Again, if it's in maybe more in that like rom-com genre. That does kind of feed into number 3 here, which is temping your film without really consideration of what the final product is going to be. And so that ties a little bit into your overall vision. Hey, we temped it, but we don't really know what we want with music. So that usually ends up getting you a temped film that has music from a lot of different sources, which actually is mistake number 4, is temping your film with too many different sources. I think a good way of going about temp music is really honing in on your reference films or your inspiration films, whether it's the film itself or the score, and using those as your temp music. Again, if it makes sense and you do like that. But having temp music, again, from the sci-fi film, from the romance film, from a piece of classical music, all of these getting together is going to kind of muddy your vision and make your process in getting your final music or getting your original music a little bit more challenging. Okay, so what happens if you don't address those specific mistakes? And again, recapping those 4 would be 1, being too attached, which is what we call temp love. Second is using temp music that doesn't fit with your film. Third challenge or mistake is temping your film without consideration or vision for the final product or the final music and score. And fourth is having temp music from too many different disparate types of sources. And so we've already kind of talked about that first sort of consequence or outcome, which is temp love. This is when a filmmaking team is too attached to the temporary music of a film because you've been hearing it with your picture for so long, and the picture and the edit has been evolving with that piece of music. The picture and edit has been evolving to that piece of music that you might not even have the rights to, or it might not have originally made sense for your film, but now it's starting to make sense because you've been editing with it so much. So that's temp love. It's very natural. It's very common. It's most in sort of that band or artist or songwriting world, it's what we would call demoitis, where you record a demo of your song and you hear it so many times, and then you finally get into a recording studio to get it tracked the right way and professionally mixed and mastered, and then you realize that, I don't know, the demo sounds better to me. And it's more oftentimes than not, it's just because you're so used to hearing that. So in order to solve that, right, you have to make the commitment to understanding that this is temporary and we are going to move on from this piece of music to get something original that makes sense for our film. Second sort of consequence there, again, as you're talking about composers, right? If you're hiring a composer, or maybe you are a composer, is pigeonholing. So if you're, and it does kind of stem from temp love, where you might be pigeonholing your composer into having to do exactly what the temp music does, which again might not make sense because of those initial mistakes that we talked about, those 4 big ones at the start of the podcast: too attached, unnecessary music without music without consideration of the final product, and then too many different sources. So pigeonholing is a really big challenge there. That's more so a challenge for someone like me to overcome as a composer when I'm working on these projects. Third, which really stems down here, is copyright issues. Now, again, not a lawyer, but you can run into challenges in that your work is potentially ripping off. If you're pigeonholing your composer to have to write music as closely as possible to your temp music, you could potentially run into a copyright issue scenario. And again, continuing to stem on this, number 4 here is just derivative and copycat work too. So maybe it's not quite a copyright issue, but the work is very clearly derivative or copycat of that piece of temp music. And it just kind of might bring your film down a level where the audience is like, wait a minute, this sounds just like, blank. And so the fifth, and really probably the biggest one here, in my opinion, from my perspective, is that you're going to potentially lack the opportunity to have a more consistent and more cohesive, narratively aligned emotional film score. Those are all my big adjectives there. Consistent, cohesive, narratively aligned, and emotional, of course, when called for. And so you're potentially removing that opportunity for your film score and your film, therefore, to fit on those adjectives: consistent, cohesive, narratively aligned, and emotional, or evoking the right emotions. You potentially run the risk of not being able to hit on those when you do struggle with temp love, or you are not temping without consideration of what the final product will be. Temp music, don't get me wrong, temp music is, like I said at the beginning, is essential for making films. How am I supposed to know what kind of music you want for your film if you're not giving me some references? So it is very important, but I always ask for that playlist. Send me a playlist of songs that you think might go well in this film, or send me some inspirational songs that you like from previous scores, which are sometimes one and the same with the temp music, because again, I want to get into the mindset. I want to understand what's going on for the tone, the mood, the vision, right? Episode 1 or 2 of this podcast goes into that. But I also want to be able to be part of that filmmaking team to tell that story of your film through that custom and original music, because it does start there. And this is kind of me going through, how to solve all of this, or how to avoid all of this, or what's the better way. And it does go back to following that end-to-end composer-director process about, what's the story, what's the mood, what's the tone, what's the vision, what's the inspiration, what are the goals, hitting on all those conversations early so that your composer can get sketching early and composing works early, so that you can get those into your film, again, early, and replace that temp music. I love being able to give an early version of a cue as early as possible to directors so that the temp can be removed, and now that early version 1.1 of the film score, even though it might be a few minutes, that becomes the new temp music, and then we can just iterate from there. And now the edit and the music can evolve together, and you're not locked in to that structured piece of temp music. We can now grow 2 things at once, the edit and the film score. And you'll find that following that process, again, that sort of end-to-end process from episode 1 or episode 2 of this podcast, where you're having those conversations early about vision, tone, mood, and goals, and get sketching early on your film score, allows you to establish trust with your film composer early. And the more you have, and the stronger trust that you have, the more likely you're gonna not rely on temp music. Plenty of examples of A-list Hollywood composers and directors not needing to do temp music anymore because they're so good in that vernacular and communicating that shared vision and getting film scores and film composers involved a lot earlier. And at the end of the day, you're actually going to get to your final product more quickly when you're able to let go of that temp music sooner, because the film score is what's going to be there at the end. So there's really a benefit there of letting go of your temp music, because you actually get to your end goal a lot quicker. Thank you so much for listening to this episode on temp music here. Just a quick little recap. The mistakes we want to avoid are getting overly attached, aka temp love, making sure that we're temping, making sure that you're not temping with unnecessary music, doesn't align, making sure you're not temping without consideration of the final product. And then if you are temping, try to keep the sources of those temp music somewhat limited, because again, we don't want to pigeonhole our composers. We don't want to run into copyright issues or have derivative or copycat work. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're moving towards a consistent, cohesive, narratively aligned, and emotionally driven film score. Some of these topics I go into a little bit with the film scoring playbook for directors. Again, that is a interactive website and guide for you, the filmmaker, to just kind of get into the brain of a composer a little bit more, so that you're more prepared and more ready for your process, for the process and the approach that you're going to have on your film score. The link will always be in the show notes of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and happy filmmaking.